My starting point for today is that on this day, in the early hours of this day in 1851, this day, for those who will be watching this at a later point, it's the 29th of August, a bunch of doctors and medical students in the early hours of the morning broke into a storage room in Nun Street in Newcastle and stole away a batch of medical specimens. Things in jars, basically, body parts, and they took them to a stable on Eldon Lane and hid them in the straw. And then, before anybody was able to call the alarm, they went back, collected another lot of medical specimens, and took them back as well. Now, this is a very peculiar thing and has its own little story attached, but that's only a part of the story that I want to tell you, because that, in a way, is just an excuse to introduce you to a gentleman called John Fife, who was incredibly well known in early Victorian Newcastle, and yet the name is now almost completely forgotten. And I think that's a shame, because he's fascinating. And the more you look at all different areas of early Victorian Newcastle, the more times his name pops up in really random places. And like I say, it's a bit of a rabbit hole to research, because the more I look up, the more interesting things I find. So I'm going to tell you some of the interesting things I found out about John Fife, basically, because he was involved in that particular raid of museum specimens, probably not actually physically doing it himself, but very much involved. So John Fife, born in 1795 to another John Fife, who was a Scottish Edinburgh-trained surgeon who'd come down to Newcastle to work. He had an elder brother, George, and both of them followed in their father's footsteps and became doctors. John, as someone of his class you would expect, went to the Royal Grammar School, qualified as a surgeon down in London, worked briefly at the army barracks in Woolwich. By the time he was 20, he was a fully qualified surgeon, working back up in Newcastle with his father. Now, fully qualified in 1815 doesn't mean quite the same as you would think. There is no one sort of standard. There's all sorts of various ways in which you can become a surgeon. Nonetheless, he had as much documentation as you needed at that point to do it. Arguably, though, he in later life did feel a bit of a sense of inferiority, or at least other people tried to make him feel that, because he had that kind of qualifications, and later on there were other kind of more formal ways of doing it. He stayed working in the area for the next 55 years, and like I say, if you look at any medical story in that period, you'll probably find he's got his sticky paws in it. There's a lot of factions going on in politics and in pretty much every area of life at that time, and it's really hard to get an unbiased opinion of him. Pretty much everyone is either going to be pro or anti him. There's some interesting things that come up if you try and find out anything about his character, though. There's an anonymous description in Sketches of Public Men in the North, which calls him clever, ready without learning, correct without being profound. If he had been more striking in mental power, he would have not been a local surgeon. Like, he could have gone on to some greater thing. Perhaps he was a big fish in a small pond, but as we'll see, his achievements go way beyond that. His obituary says that he has a straight figure, an elastic walk, and his mind was keen and intelligent. He was involved in an awful lot of different areas. So let's take politics first. That's the area I know least about, I'm least qualified to talk about, really, but nonetheless you have to kind of touch on it a bit because it's part of who he was, clearly. It's clear when he was actually interested in a subject, he could be very articulate on it. People said he was a great orator, but the Sketches, again, also says that he wasn't really in his element in politics, that his taste, his associations, the character of his mind and thoughts unfit him for a discussion on a township rate or a debate on pipe drainage or whether the egg-shaped or flat-bottomed sewer is the safest and best. I think all that sort of stuff just really didn't interest him, and therefore he didn't get terribly involved in it. What he was interested in was electoral reform, and this is, of course, the time when that's a big deal. He became a Whig politician in his 20s, and from very early on in that, he was arguing in favour of the Reform Bill, of expanding the franchise so that more people could vote. Which is the thing, ultimately, that gets Earl Grey's statue on top of that there monument. And he was a Chartist, which is to say people who want to extend the franchise, which there were Whigs, and then there were the kind of more radical end of Whigs. So he was initially a bit more on the radical side of things. In 1832, he was one of the great campaigners of something called the Northern Political Union. He's said to have a style of gentlemanly ease when he spoke, and that he didn't talk down to people from other classes, but just spoke to them in a normal way, which was quite unusual for someone of his class. And all of this work did eventually lead to the Reform Bill that year. But the Reform Bill only gave a fraction of what a lot of the Chartists wanted. It helped middle-class gentlemen, but did nothing for the working class, because there was still a quite high barrier in terms of money or land ownership or property ownership that you'd have to meet before you could vote. So it's only a little step in that direction. And demonstrations, therefore, continue. Fife becomes less involved. Instead, he gets involved in, or at least this is what some people would say about him, we'll come to the other view in a bit. Instead he became an alderman, and then in 1839 he became the mayor of Newcastle. And this obviously puts him in charge of law and order, and this is a time when the Chartists are increasingly demonstrating a lot. So he's got a real tension there, that the things that he used to be part of the campaign, he used to be, you know, on the lines of the demos, and now he's the mayor. And there were these demonstrations, and he tried to control them. He said they had to happen out on the town moor. They had wanted to demonstrate inside the town itself, and he said he was having none of that because there was a greater risk of it leading to rioting and so on. So they could do it in the town moor, big safe space, and there were huge, huge meetings of Chartists out there. But, as so often happens, a minority in the crowd become more violent. A crowd is dispersed, and some of those who are dispersed go into town and then start causing trouble. The whole thing escalated. And it escalated to the point, actually, where, in the end, he did read the Riot Act, which is a literal thing back then, and in the end he did order soldiers to fix bayonets to disperse the crowd. Now, I don't know about you, my first instinct in the modern world is a bit of a boo hiss, but it's a bit more complicated than that. The Chartist papers certainly saw this as a massive betrayal, that he had once been of their cause and had now changed completely. This was reported in a Chartist paper as the Battle of the Forth. And they said, I never believed it possible that John Fife would, with his own hands, seize upon and break to pieces a banner he himself had often and enthusiastically marched under, or that he would order policemen to stab their fellow men for doing merely that which he himself had told them 100 times to do. Now, nobody was killed or even seriously injured in this. It was a scare tactic, and it was a scare tactic that worked. So comparisons that were occasionally made at the time with the likes of Peterloo are not justified. Could he have dealt with it differently? It's very hard to say. He won a knighthood for it, and that in turn made him more enemies, because the knighthood for his courage and sound judgment was obviously seen as a betrayal by people on the other side. His popularity certainly declined from it. Some of the more radical people were able to argue that clearly he'd only been interested in it as long as it was his own class, the middle class, that benefited from electoral reform, and after that it didn't matter to him anymore. It's not entirely fair. He'd spent the intervening years actually trying to build bridges across the Whig party from its more radical side to its more moderate side. And as ever, if you try for enough of a compromise, you probably make enemies of everybody. Certainly, he could have been a lot more violent. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it could have been worse. Maybe that's all we can say. He can't have done that badly in offending the people that counted, though, because in 1843, he was mayor again, and he did continue to try to woo the radical vote and to try and express himself as, you know, a Chartist, but one who valued the law and order of the town enough to stamp down the more riotous elements of the Chartist movement. And he stayed in the council, Newcastle Council, until 1862. The final straw for his resignation was a very complicated thing to do with the cattle market that I haven't been able to completely get my head around. The bit of it that has stuck with me is that he was accused by another gentleman of being ungentlemanly, and retorted that, well, you, sir, are a coward and a poltroon. I do love 19th century insult. They're so much better than modern ones. And things got very heated. The meeting had to be broken up, and he, the next morning, sent a letter saying, "I'm never setting foot in the council room again, if that's how I'm going to be treated." And he didn't, much to a lot of people's surprise. So that was a bit strange. He was a very busy man. As well as this political career, up to and including being mayor, he had his private practice as a physician. He had work in various hospitals. He was in charge of the medical provision in various hospitals at different times. He was a lecturer. He was an advisor to places like Pitts about their medical treatment facilities. He got married and had 6 children, raised 6 children successfully. One of whom became a doctor. And he also had his fingers in a lot of other pies. He was involved in anti-Corn Law campaigning, in anti-slavery campaigning. He became a big part of the volunteer movement, which was raising volunteer part-time army units. The rules and regs on those were quite relaxed, leading to one critic saying that he now had despotic power over these units, and that the private who joined up would be exposed to his unchecked caprice. That he had self-elected himself to a rank in one time that he did not deserve, and that he had promoted a surgeon with no real experience over somebody else, the second person being a man of ability and independent, and these qualities united Sir John Fife cannot bear. So there's that. He was involved in the positioning of the railways as part of the council. He's supposed to be the person who persuaded Hudson, the railway king, to put the railway line through Newcastle where it is. Hudson had wanted to put the line to bypass the centre of Newcastle, because that's obviously a lot more effort to build, and instead to cross the Tyne at Peelaw. And it was allegedly John Fife who said, no, you've got to put it right in the middle of town, and that led to the creation of the high-level bridge. He also argued for the pedestrianised, the other half of the high-level bridge, and argued that as a medical man, he knew that horses would not be disturbed by what they could not see, and therefore it was quite safe to have them running in parallel to the railways. He was president of the Mechanics Institute. He was a patron of the arts. In 1860, he's a patron of a concert which raised money for Garibaldi's army in Italy, so he's involved in the international scene as well. He's a magistrate in Newcastle, and somehow also a magistrate for the county of Argyll, which seems quite impressive. His family came from that area, and his family still had a sort of country house up in Argyll, and so he became magistrate for them. I can't imagine he ever did very much work for them up there, but he did it. Some of the things, his opinions we have on record from the council minutes are a bit less complimentary to him. He repeatedly argued against the idea of the corporation having its own fire brigade. At this point, fire services were private services funded by people taking out fire insurance. And in 1846, he very much said, no, this was a bad thing, because the increase in taxes would be very unpopular. The council debated the issue a second time, 8 years later, and again he said that he thought it was not a good plan. And 2 weeks later, the Great Fire of Newcastle and Gateshead happened. He was working in the infirmary at the time and would have been able to see all of the consequences of not having a fire service. Not that any fire service could necessarily have done very much in the face of the massive explosions of that particular event in 1854. He was also on the Town Improvement Committee, where apparently he didn't do a very good job. The cholera commissioners showed up in 1846 to find out basically why cholera had spread where it had and how bad it was within the town. And some of his answers show that he didn't really understand what powers the council had in cleaning the streets and the like. And he thought that there wasn't a problem that there was a severe lack of privies on Sandgate, because the land sloped down to the river, and therefore rainwater would just wash everything away. Someone point out to him that it doesn't, always rain, even in Newcastle. And he also said that, people could just empty their chamber pots straight into the river, so that was fine. This is a medical man. Very strange. And the cholera commissioner concluded that the corporation had totally neglected its powers to improve public health, to which he said, we may have partly neglected them, but not totally. Seriously. But for me, of course, the really interesting bit is his activities as a surgeon, and not even so much his day-to-day surgical practice, although we can find out a bit about that, but some of the other things he ended up doing. His specialisms were in bladder stones, which he actually, ironically, himself suffered from in later life, military surgery, and eye surgery. And as young as 27, he was the key mover in founding the specialist eye hospital in Newcastle. He was considered to be rather a presumptuous youth by the older generation, and that feeling didn't go away particularly quickly, to be founding his own hospital at age 27, but that was the kind of drive he had. And bear in mind the kind of person you have to be to do operations of that kind in a time before general anaesthetic, or anaesthetic at all, really. Get somebody really drunk and then stab into their eye, it doesn't bear thinking about. In fact, this was the case for the first couple of decades of his career. Anaesthetics weren't widely available until the mid-1840s, and actually his story comes in again at that point, because in 1848, a young lady, 15-year-old girl called Hannah Greener, went into the Newcastle Infirmary, the one on Forth Banks, and she had an ingrown toenail that needed surgery. And she'd had this operation done previously on another toenail, and she'd been anaesthetised with ether a couple of years earlier. In 1848, she was anaesthetised with chloroform, and she died. And she was the first known human death that came from something going wrong with chloroform ever. And John Fife took the lead on the autopsy of that case. There's been a lot of consideration since as to whether he's right in his conclusions, whether she could have been savable. It's something that anaesthesiologists with an interest in history sometimes go back to and pick at to try to work out exactly what happened, but of course that's very tough in hindsight. When he started out, of course, and for the next few years after that, there is a much greater demand for corpses than there are available corpses, because there are lots of trainee surgeons, lots of people want to learn these things, but the only people available to them, the only bodies available, are a very limited number of criminals who have committed particular crimes and been executed, and this was a part of their punishment. Now, there are various direct results from that, from body snatching to Burke and Hare, which I might talk about on another occasion, but let's leave that aside for now. It did mean when a body was available, it was big news, and John Fife was in a position to take advantage of this. In 1829, Jane Jameson is hanged for the murder of her mother in a drunken rage, and her body is sent to the barber surgeons to be dissected. First woman hanged in town for over 50 years, so of course this is a huge deal. Over 20,000 people turn up to witness the hanging. And yes, John Fife is described in the diary of Thomas Gordiani Wright, who was there in the audience, says that John Fife gave a very good demonstration on the brain of Jameson, and had good opportunity from the freshness of the brain before him to exhibit its parts and structure in a clear manner. The audience altogether might be about 50, of whom almost 1/3 were non-professionals. People would just turn up just to watch the dissection, even though they'd have to pay 2 shillings and 6pence for the privilege. When there aren't any modern corpses to look at, of course, you can always go back to looking at old ones, and exactly a year after he had been playing with the brain of Jane Jameson, John Fife was also involved with unwrapping a very, very old body, which was the mummy of, and I always forget how to pronounce this, it's not Irtu, but it's Irtyu, sort of, although of course that's taken from hieroglyphics, so who knows. This mummy had been sent back to Europe by Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt, and via various circuitous routes had found its way to John Bowes Wright, who then passed it to the Lytton Phil. And as you would expect of a gentleman of education of his time, John Fife was very involved with the Lytton Phil. And 3 surgeons, and he's one of them, removed, over the course of 2 hours, 22.5 kilograms of bandages. I've seen one tiny scrap. For a long time it was thought they'd all been completely lost, but there is a little tiny bit remaining of one of those bandages, which is really, really cool. And underneath, the surgeons found a well-preserved specimen, sepia brown, with perfect teeth, pendulous breasts, which seems a strange turn of phrase, but there you go, long red hair and some mobility in the limbs, and various amulets and beads and things like that. They decided the best thing to do with her at that point was to fix her spine to the back of the coffin with a metal staple and a hook on her skull so that she could be displayed upright, and then they could charge a penny per view at the Lytton Phil for people to go and see her. Unfortunately, at this point, she also met with some carpet beetles, so they had to shut her back up again after a while. But of course, using old mummies is really no substitute when it comes to teaching dissection. So to understand how the story goes from here, because it becomes the story of the Newcastle Medical School, in effect, we have to know about the Anatomy Act. In 1832, the government's response to things like burking and body snatching was to say that in the new Act, any corpse which is unclaimed for 48 hours, regardless of where it is, likely to be in a workhouse, but also includes things like people fished out the river, after 48 hours, they could be legally handed to a medical school. And only 3 months after this, lectures begin in Bell's Court with a new medical school. And John Fife is one of the 6 lecturers involved, and his brother, George, is another one of them. It may even have been George's idea, although it seems to be John that ran with it and became, you know, the driving force behind it. And that particular establishment is in a direct line of succession to Newcastle University, which makes Newcastle the only university that starts off with its medical faculty before any others. And John Fife gave the very first lecture, so effectively he gave the first lecture of Newcastle University ever, which is nice. James Miller was one of the attendees of these lectures, and he said they were delivered in a large room fitted up as a lecture room, which had adjoining it a small retiring room for the lectures. The room was crowded with medical men and their pupils, because a lot of the older generation would never have had a chance to go to these sort of lectures either, or if they had, it was, 30 years previously, so they appreciated it as well. Other students included John's own eldest son, Henry, and a chap called John Snow. No, not that one. And John Snow is best known for working out that cholera is waterborne. When he was in London, you may have heard the story of the Broad Street pump in London. John Snow was a local who had first met cholera in the pit villages of Tyneside before moving down to London for its second wave, where these important discoveries were made. Bell's Court was fine for the lectures, but it wasn't very good for dissections, and so they came up with the plan of renting out the space in the Barber Surgeons' Hall. Now, the Barber Surgeons, as a guild, had a huge guild house that had been built 200 years previously and then added to. And John Fife made this agreement that they would rent the space and they partition it into sort of a lecture room and a dissecting room and a chemistry room and so on. And the bit above is a museum. Now, it's been a museum for a long time. The museum has always belonged to the Barber Surgeons. We know about this because Celia Fiennes, who's a sort of gentle lady tourist back in 1699, she visited Newcastle and she talked about there being this amazing specimens that you could touch bits of preserved human skin and look at various body parts in jars and things. So they've been building this collection up for a good 150 years at this point, and it's just upstairs. And various lectures happen, and we still have surviving some of the prospectuses for some of these lectures. And I was looking at this morning and stumbled upon my favourite being this whole sort of set of chemistry, and John Fife is teaching basic principles in surgery. And then after a few of these, you get gratuitous lectures in operative surgery will be delivered to the pupils attending the school as opportunities occur, which gives me this wonderful vision of, "Oi, Wilkins, come here, it's time for some gratuitous lectures in operative surgery. Bring my saw." Of course they mean gratuitous as in free and extra, but that's not the way I like to see it. Having got this set up, of course, Fife is able to indulge in some of his other interests, which leads me to perhaps the strangest feature of the man. he was very keen on phrenology, which is the study of the lumps and bumps on your head and the shape of your head, the shape of your face, to determine aspects of character. And he was absolutely convinced that this was all true, and you could tell character by looking at these lumps and bumps and measuring things very carefully. He became the chairman of the local phrenological society, which had a surprising array of the great and the good of the town, other mayors and magistrates, bankers, and so on. This group called itself, with a certain amount of hubris, I suspect, the British Phrenological Society. This was the Newcastle-based group. This was because, probably, the British Association for the Advancement of Science had held a meeting in Newcastle where someone had tried to do a bit of talk on phrenology and been roundly dismissed, and then they banned phrenology from being part and said, it's not a scientific discipline, you can't be part of this organisation. So they said, oh, well, if the British Association for the Advancement of Science won't let us in, we'll have our own British Phrenological Society meeting next door. John Fife was the chairman of this society, and he saw phrenology largely in terms of ways to improve the justice system. As I say, he was a magistrate, both locally and up in Argyll. Most of what we know about his views come from reports in the Newcastle Journal, which was the Tory rag of the time, so we can't be entirely sure he's being fairly represented here. But as it appears, he presented in 1838 a plan for the most important and feasible measure of practical utility that ever entered the imagination of any great public character. He wanted a bill introduced which would authorise the examination of the head of every single man, woman and child looking for signs of criminality. Why wait until the person actually commits a crime when you can spot their criminal character from the start? He said anyone with a large combativeness zone in their skull either has committed murder or surely will do so if suffered to live. On the grand maxim, then, that it is better to prevent crime than punish it, all such people should be at once consigned to the gallows and the gibbet. He's seriously trying to predict who the murderers are and kill them in advance of them committing any murders on the basis of the shape of their skull. Brilliant! And this is a man who's this would be a few months before he becomes mayor. It's crazy. This idea is passed on to the Prime Minister. This is how important he is. He's only, 2 steps away from people like the Prime Minister. There's an MP he knows called Joseph Hume, who is also a fan of phrenology. He passes the scheme to him, who passes it to the Prime Minister. Joseph Hume reported that he himself thought it was a great idea, and also that the Prime Minister was overjoyed at the thought of getting involved. The official response from the Prime Minister was, of course, rather different, and he writes back to John Fife, saying, upon reflection, I am astonished that any person professing to be a supporter of my government should have concocted so monstrous a scheme as that set forth at the memorial of the phrenologists of Newcastle. I have therefore to beg you to convey to the individuals alluded to, and more particularly to its author, Mr. Alderman Fife, the expression of my high displeasure at the mere contemplation of such a project. It's possible that the group never met again. Certainly they disbanded fairly shortly after, although Fife seems to have continued to use phrenology as part of his work as a magistrate. There's one thief he condemns, for instance, where he says, well, he's got a large organ of secretiveness, so I'm sure he's guilty. Worrying, right? So, back to Bell's Court. Already there are 2 kind of factions developing within the surgeons, which tend to coincide with the 2 political parties and also with the Bell's Court lot versus the traditional apprenticeship training lot. Those things all tend to run together. And this was widely known. Some people wished that they would leave their battles in the surgical training field instead of taking it to the corporation, and that the public health would never be sorted out in Newcastle Corporation until they left their feuds at home. We can see it in 1840. There's the death of a lady called Susanna Quinn. Susanna Quinn is an Irish woman who has just died, dropped dead, in Clogger's Entry, which is a little passageway on the head of the side. Embleton describes this particular passageway as long since happily improved off the face of the earth. which is, so many pounds worth of improvements done by the earthquake, isn't it? Happily improved off the face of the earth. Her relatives were around, but they didn't want to claim the body because they thought that would mean they'd have to pay for the funeral. So they did nothing. And so the men from Bell's Court turned up to take the body away. While she was being prepared for dissection, her daughter suddenly realised what was going on and went to the mayor and complained. And the mayor is said to have shown up, saying, "I'll not show you a ha'porth of leniency. It shan't be done here. You'll be taking the live ones next." This only makes sense when you realise this is only 1 year. This is the successor mayor to John Fife. This is John Carr, who is a Tory, the exact political opposite of John Fife, and from the other faction of the physicians, and clearly this is political point scoring. For a while he stopped lecturing and was mostly into his politics for a few years. And then we come to the really silly bit, which is the bust-up of 1851, when various members of the school fall out. It starts off with what seems like it should be quite a small thing. Presumably there were other problems before this, but there is a dispute over the appointment of a surgeon to one of the districts of the Poor Law Union. There are two candidates, both have their supporters amongst other surgeons. Before long, there are some people insulting each other's professional integrity, and then after that, they're insulting each other's personal character. And eventually, one of them is pressurised to resign or else, and he refuses. And when he refuses, the others all say that they're not going to work with him, and the entire school dissolves. Meanwhile, there's problems coming in other directions, because the land that the Barber Surgeons' Hall is on, that they're having their dissections and so on, has been bought out by the railway. And they've said, we'll promise that we'll build you another bigger, better facility, but it'll take a while, so in the meanwhile, you'll just have to deal with it. And they do eventually knock down the Barber Surgeons' Hall. The one bit that survives is, if you know your way around Newcastle, you know where the old Swan House roundabout is. And on the far side of the Swan House roundabout, there's one little whitewashed building next to the... So you see it there, and there's the whole of the big viaduct running by you. And that was the gardener's house. It started out as the janitor's room and the gardener's room, but once the main building is gone, it has to start serving as a place for the preparation of the anatomical specimens as well. So you've then got two factions. The majority faction is effectively homeless, and they start using this old janitor's building. They build a temporary structure outside it as well. And the minority faction form a different medical school, with Fife as the president. This is the Newcastle upon Tyne College of Medicine and Practical Science. And the two sides are bickering in the Lancet, both writing letters to the editor about how they're the one that knows what's going on and the other lot of rubbish, pledging support to each other, blacking the names of members of the other one, and so on. Eventually there's an editorial note in the Lancet which says, "I understand that the good people of Newcastle have been kept in a state of excitement by the battle of the two schools, in which the worthy doctors have been purging and scarifying each other for the edification of the public. As to the probable demerits of both schools, I am profoundly ignorant. Perhaps an obliging reader will inform me which is which, as I suspect, like Caesar and Pompey, they are very much alike, especially Pompey." He was confused, clearly, by the entire thing, and frankly, anybody reading it would be. It's all very strange. One thing that is clear, though, is that both lots wanted to get their hands on the Anatomy Museum, because without an Anatomy Museum, schools of medicine can't be recognised by the College of Surgeons or the Apothecaries Society, which means you can't get fully qualified. So both of them really want to have it. The majority faction can't keep it in the Barber Surgeons' Hall anymore because that's being demolished. Take it to a storage place in Nun Street, which is where we come back to the beginning of our story. Overnight, members of the minority school broke in and carried off a lot of the specimens. This leads to, among other things, the writing by a local poet, John Cargill, of a long and ridiculous and strange satirical poem, which is clearly a parody of a Scots border ballad. It's called The Knights of St. John and the Cross, or The Raid on the Old Musee. It's really bizarre. It's got a plot. It takes you through the story, sort of, but you can see the style. It's also done in a kind of cod Scottish or cod Borders accent, which is really quite terrible, and I won't attempt it. But lines like, "But oh, what a show round about and below, livers steeped in the briny bree, light stomachs and hearts, and all the parts that give us signs of human infirmity. But the bonniest prize which that night might devise was the thousands of bottled mannikins grey, like the weest monks in their cowls, nay mortal might tell were they child or fay." They must have had lots of embryos or something in little glass bottles, and these were being carried around in the dark. You can see how someone might think this was a good subject for taking the mick, basically, with the whole it being like a border reaving raid, but with specimens instead of cows. At this point, a new barber surgeon's hall was being built on Victoria Street, which is also sometimes called the Rye Hill one, confusingly, given that Rye Hill is the next street along. It was finished in October, and it was immediately rented by Fife's group. The other lot said, "Oh, well, we're just not competing with you over that. We're not willing to get into this sort of childish scuffle. And besides, that hall, that's the barber surgeons' hall, well, that's the barber surgeons and tallow chandlers, candle makers' hall. And we don't really want to associate with barbers and candle makers, actually, so we'll go and rent a different property instead." They instead they're continuing to use the barber surgeons' facilities, and they hire the Lytton Phil for their first lecture, and both of the schools have their inaugural lecture on the same night in October 1851. The minority group one at Rye Hill is given, once again, by John Fife. It all gets a bit weird and complicated after that. The majority lot associate themselves with the University of Durham. They try to get permission to have a new building next to the infirmary. The infirmary oddly says it doesn't want one. This is probably the voice of John Fife, who is very influential in the infirmary, not wanting to help out the competition. And so they end up moving to all places near the Lytton Phil, which doesn't work. They move into the Mining Institute briefly, which doesn't work. And in the end, they end up in a block alongside the Lytton Phil, and that's in a block with the Mining Institute and the Natural History Society, and that forms a nice sort of natural zone, which in many ways is better than the Rye Hill facility. And eventually they do recombine in 1857. After 2 or 3 years of negotiation, it seems that tempers had cooled down sufficiently that the two groups reformed, strengthened the ties with Durham, and became what would eventually become the Newcastle Medical School that became the medical department of the university. Fife was one of the signatories of that deal and stayed with them for another 10 years. As a last little note of something weird that he got up to, one of his interests in later life seems to have been Turkish bathing and the beneficial effects of Turkish bathing. John Fife's daughter Harriet had married a chap called George Crawshay, who was also a doctor, and he had seen a Turkish bath and been so impressed that he'd come straight home to his house in Tynemouth and built one there, which, as far as anyone knows, is the first Turkish bath built in England since Roman times. It was just in a domestic house in Tynemouth. John Fife, his father-in-law, turned up, was incredibly impressed with this, and he wrote to a friend, "I have been restored to youth by being boiled, or rather roasted, alive in the bath of the Romans." And the two men then got together to recommend that the infirmary should get itself one. And it was the first hospital in England to install a medicinal Turkish bath. The initial design, by John Dobson, 12,000 Turkish baths in its first year. Only a handful of people with burns and only one who nearly died. Perfectly reasonable, right? Trouble was, the initial design heated the floor very, very hot. So if your shoes, your special clogs, fell off, you might burn your feet. And one gentleman actually fell and couldn't get back up, and, as I say, very nearly died, at which point they started to change the design. But throughout this, John Fife remained convinced of the beneficial effects of the Turkish bath. And yeah, he lived another 10 years or so. Suffered a bit when he had bladder stones, but kept on going for a little while after that. Well, retired, but kept on going a bit after that. And then had a very short illness and died. And lived long enough to be into the age of photography. So there is, you can look up, there is a couple of really nice pictures of him, one with 2 of his grandchildren. So I find him a really hard man to assess in all. It's very complicated. It's a very mixed set of interesting things going on there. He's definitely getting stuck into everything of his time. And some really progressive ideas and some really backward ideas. And it's all a really big, complicated story. But all we can say for sure, like I say, is if there's anything interesting going on in early mid-Victorian Newcastle, he's probably in it somewhere. And one of these days I'll get around to writing a book, because somebody should. He really deserves it. So that was quite a long one, I suspect. I don't know what time it is, but I think that was quite a long one. I shall leave you at that point and see what fun stuff I can come up with for you for next week. Okay? Okay, take care all, and good night.